Tonight we have, which I announced anyway last month, we have Gearóid Ó Tuathaigh with us. He doesn't realise this now, but the first time we met him was 40 years ago, in October, when he gave a talk on, you probably don't even remember, he gave a talk on industries in Limerick, referring really to ranks and firms like that. But we were waiting for him for a while to come here. Well, not waiting for him, but give him a chance before we asked him to come, you know. But I've heard him so many times over the years, I could only get things off by heart now at this stage. But anyway, we'd like to welcome Gearoid anyway tonight, and as most of you know, he's spent all his life nearly, I suppose, above in UCG. And there's a big word that I'm afraid to use, is it emeritus, is it? It's a very kind of, it's like immaculate now. It's a very big word. But I fell in left school at 14 and I can't barely get my tongue around marmalade, you know. Anyway, Gearoid tonight will talk about, I suppose, Limerick and growing up in Limerick and things associated with that. And we find it most informative anyway, okay? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, no, thanks, Tony, and indeed thanks for the invitation. I suppose the first thing I'd better do is to say a quick word of explanation for the title. The distinction between a memoir, as it were, and a memory book. I was only talking about it recently because the writer and playwright Tom Kilroy published before Christmas a memory book, essentially. And he made the distinction. It's not quite the same distinction as I would make myself, but he asked me to launch it, so we had an opportunity to have a chat about it. And the main difference, I suppose, is this, that a memoir or an autobiography is essentially centred on the life of the writer and what the writer's background and youth and so on. Whereas a memory book is a little bit messier, but in its way more interesting, because it has to do not only with the memoir, which is the central part of it, but also with the history, the social history, the social and historical milieu within which the writer's youth was spent. In the case of Kilroy being Kilroy, he added 2 or 3 chapters of fiction, historical fiction, but I'm not going to do that. What I have in mind, in fact, is a good deal less ambitious, but nevertheless, I hope will be of interest. My exploration of the past, in this instance, the historical episode, as it were, of Limerick in the 1950s, those, I think, have an axis that is inherently of some interest. I'm a historian by profession. I have spent more than 50 years writing and talking about the past in a very particular way. That is to say, talking about the past in accordance with the rules and conventions of historical inquiry and of research and of exposition. In other words, particular method of dealing with the past and the evidence and so on. But on the other hand, I lived through the 1950s in Limerick. I have a bank of memories of my childhood and adolescence in the city. In a word, I am in a very particular way, I might be seen, as it were, as embodying the link and the tension between memory and history. There are strong views about that link, and these views generally see history and memory as being implacably opposed. The American historian Richard White, whose mother came from outside Ballylongford in North Kerry, wrote a book called A Hannah Gran many years ago. And he indicated why it was that he was attracted to the history of the home place, as it were, his mother's home place. Because of all the stories he'd heard, because of all the legends, because of her own personal story. And then this is what he wrote. And I think it's quite revealing. He said, memory and history are enemies. They struggle with each other. And I'll give him his own words. I thought once, he said, that my mother's stories were history. I thought memory was history. Then I became a historian, and after many years I have come to realize that only careless historians confuse memory and history. History is the enemy of memory. The two stalk each other across the fields of the past, claiming the same terrain. History forges weapons from what memory has forgotten or suppressed. Few non-historians realise how many scraps a life leaves. These scraps do not necessarily form a story in and of themselves, but they are always calling stories into doubt, always challenging memories, always trailing off into forgotten places. Now, I should say in advance that I'm not a subscriber to the view that history and memory are necessarily implacable enemies. But they are different ways of accessing the past, of dealing with it. And they are different ways in which we make the past present in the now, in our own lives, and at different times. The particular segment of the past that provides the richest vein for exploring the uses and value of memory and history, for me, of course, personally, is the Limerick of my youth and adolescence, between 1945 and 1962. You can do your arithmetic and know that I'm 74. There are specific factors that I think are of interest for that exploration for me. Firstly, thanks to the Frank McCourt controversy and all that followed it, accounts of Limerick from the 1930s and 40s in particular have been strongly contested. Versions of the Limerick of the 1940s strongly contested, and plenty of books about it. Much recollecting and much refuting following the McCourt success. Secondly, it's a period and it's a terrain, Limerick, that is extraordinarily richly illustrated and documented, not only through the Limerick Journal, but also through an extraordinary photographic record that has emerged over the last 30 years in particular. A photographic record, in other words, an illustration to prompt and corroborate recollections of place and the lived landscape of the city. And thirdly, and finally, there is the fact that having left Limerick in 1962, my memories of the 1950s Limerick have not been mediated, as it were, by the direct experience of living through the changing landscape, both physical and cultural, of the city during the past 56 years. This is not to suggest, of course, that I have been entirely absent from Limerick. It wasn't that hard to track me down, Tony Brown. But having said that, I haven't been absent, of course, totally for the last half-century. Nor do I want to claim that my memory of the 1950s in Limerick is in any sense frozen and uncontaminated. But there is a common view that the exile may have a more deeply embedded sense and recall of the place of origin and youth, as it was just at the point of his departure, than the native of the place who lived and who has spent their life, as it were, inhabiting and sharing in the changing complexion of his native place. This is often used, for example, for James Joyce. It is often said that if all of the records, historical records of Edwardian Dublin were to vanish on the morning, that you could reconstruct Dublin from Joyce's Ulysses. His recall was so lucid and in such detail. Now, I make no such claim at all. Exile in this sense is not an appropriate description of how I have related to my native place in the decade since I first left Limerick in 1962. But there is, I believe, a perspective and a recall that, when tested in the crucible of conventional historical evidence, may prove a bit suggestive this evening when I check, as it were, my memories against the historical evidence such as it is of 1950s Limerick. Now, that's enough of preaching and saying what I was going to do and why I have called it what I've called it. Make it down to business. What does the historical data tell us about 1950s Limerick? Well, 1950s Ireland, as we know, the historiography of it, the history writing about it, is uniformly bleak. It's the decade of massive emigration. 408,000 net loss of population in the 1950s. It's the decade of economic stagnation. It's the decade of decline. It's the final dregs of the revolutionary generation, the introspection and all the rest of it. It is the decade in which the American sociologists and anthropologists came to Ireland asking the question aloud, is Ireland dying? Is the country dying of anemia because of the numbers that were leaving? The record is, as I say, uniformly historiography of the Republic, certainly. The final sterile phase, we are told, of De Valera. David McCullough's verdict in the recent book is that De Valera stayed too long, and indeed so did most of the revolutionary generation. A succession of economic crises, a succession of changes of government between 1948 and 1957, corresponding to the ever-worsening cycle of economic crisis, and the mood of despair, the mood of disillusion, pervasive sense of failure, encapsulated in the famous letter, the private letter that Whitaker wrote to De Valera coming to the end of the decade, saying, the people are asking, was it all a waste of time, the revolution and the establishment of the state? There's such a wide sense of disappointment and of disillusion. The writings on the 50s again talk about the cultural scene, oppressively clericalist and introspective, conservative, with censorship, with church influence having the country in an iron grip, and with nothing but exile or exit for writers and artists. Now, there are, it is true, some challenges in recent times to this bleak view, but by and large, this is the dominant view, as it were, of the 1950s. So far as Limerick is concerned, however, once you look at the data, a different story, or at least a more complex story, emerges. Limerick did not suffer, the city certainly did not suffer a major demographic decline in the 1950s. Now, it is true, and one has to be careful, that the boundary of the city was doubled in 1950. Therefore, comparing populations before 1950 and after has to be done with great care. But nevertheless, in the 1950s, the population of the city, unlike the county, remained relatively stable, and in fact it increased very modestly, less than 1,000, between 1951, the 1951 census, and the 1961 census, when it stood at about 51,800. So it's not, the city is not a story of demographic decline. Nor, I think, is there a sense that Limerick is declining in other ways once you look at it. There is, for example, an expansive dimension to Limerick in the 1950s. There's a good deal of new building going on. The provision of corporation housing schemes, which was launched in the early 1930s to alleviate poor living conditions and congestion, this building continued, of course, from the late 1940s through the 1950s. There was no huge interruption. Ballinanty was completed in 1950, Rathban in 1952, Ballinacurra Weston soon afterwards. You'd also have to add Assumpta Park, buildings in Gearoid. Tenements in Clare Street were demolished in the mid-1950s. Edward Street and the Waterboy housing replacement in Prospect and beyond Hyde Road progressively extended. And it's not only housing. Church and school generally followed within a short interval. Our Lady of Lourdes, of course, followed by the Presentation School in Jamesborough in 1952. And infrastructure generally also saw developments in the 1950s. The Limerick Regional Hospital opened in May of 1955. The Limerick Maternity Hospital in the Ennis Road started in 1958 and opened in 1963. St. Munchin's College in Corbally, once the decision was reached to move out from Henry Street, started in the late 1950s to facilitate that move and opened for business in 1962. There was some transition. And other signs of confidence in the future, apart from infrastructure. There were businesses opening and money being spent. For example, in what would be now grandly called the hospitality industry, Stevie Foley bought the Shannon Arms from the old Villiers, and it purchased in 1954, opened in 1955. The Hotel Cecil opened in 1956. There were new things and new premises and money being spent and money being ventured. In retail, about which I'll have a little more later, it was a crowded and highly variegated retail sector in Limerick in the 1950s. But of course, one of the more notable aspects of 1950s Limerick was the arrival of the Italian families for the cafes and the restaurants, the DeVitos and the others, arriving to establish their various outlets, the Gaiety, the Savoy, the Roma, and of course the great one that opened when we were all young, Café Capri, the Café Capri. Industries. Traditional industries were still the spine of employment in Limerick City in the 1950s. Clothing and shoes, Condensed Milk Company, Cleves, tobacco manufacturing, mineral waters, bacon factories in particular, Matterson's, O'Mara's and Shaw's. The grain silo in Ranks, for example, was not completed until 1954. Again, these are physical signs of confidence of the future, of investment, of industries that were not in any sense doomed or seemed to be destined to decline. Portering, casual dock labour and distribution, and indeed some of the older traditional industries had, as it true, retreated, like lace making and so on, had retreated to the Good Shepherd already by the 1950s. But nonetheless, the major staples were still huge employers. Now, when I recall these things and when you see the evidence for it, did these register at the time? Did they register with a young boy? Anecdotes are what principally grab your attention. Changing patterns of labour particularly is an interesting one, and an anecdote encapsulates this very well. The building techniques which had been pioneered in England after the Second World War were beginning to be used by building contractors in Ireland. That wasn't welcomed by everybody, in particular mechanisation. I remember when the maternity hospital was being built, there was a man who, as we used to say, Lord, give a more idea, whose nerves were at him, as that's the phrase it was at the time. A man who used to speak to himself out loud, walking on the streets and so on. His wife, who was a saint in the family, if you like, lexicon of our family, at least my aunt thought she was a saint, she turned him out so well. Every day he'd walk into town and go down past the building that was going on in the maternity hospital. And buttered brogues, and of course cavalry twill and the whole lot. And I remember the phrase always used about it was, he's turned out as if he walked out of Billy Higgins's window. that was the phrase to see how well turned out he was. But interestingly, to register the way things were changing, once the beginning of the building started in the maternity hospital, what mostly offended him was the arrival of the cranes. And he'd stand outside and raise his fist and say, doing good men out of work. Again, it encapsulates the point at which the labour culture itself of construction changes and registers and sticks in the mind, and the date is easy because you can fix it, but otherwise it would just be a memory of a man shouting in the street. That was one area. Again, the decade, the 1950s, as we all know, was bookmarked at both ends by major and damaging fires. The tannery in 1950 and Todd's in 1959. And indeed, in between, there were others. The Danis' premises, for example, in Patrick Street was destroyed in 1953, but they relocated up to Dominic Street. And in fact, none of the three were put out of business by fires. Todd's or Leather or Danis', none of them were put out of business definitively by the fires. In fact, the tannery and Danis would later succumb to competition and by the logic of a changing manufacturing regime in the 1970s. But it wasn't the fires of the 50s that done for them, as it were. Now, the city, therefore, is not one that can be characterised by the evidence as a place of decline, either demographically, in terms of the economic activity, in terms of signs of new investment, infrastructure, housing, and so on. It is expansive, but it has a great variety in it itself. What version of the city, therefore, does my memory of growing up here shape for me? First thing I remember, and the thing that would immediately strike me, is the sense of territory, how local territories were, how very local territories were at the time. And that begins with schooling and with education. Mine, I was born in Tuamingate in the nursing home, the Line-In home, and then I was reared at the very top of Farnshaw, just at the very edge, up from 100 yards from Lanny Fraser's. The edge, essentially, of Old Tuamingate and the start of what would have been on the upper end of it, moving more and more towards the city home and up towards the red bricks and onto the grander terrain of the Ennis Road. Therefore, my territory, as it were, was the territory of schooling. Killeely first, the Crossroad down to the Coosheen, Hassett's Cross afterwards, and then across the town, a huge gap over to Sexton Street for secondary. An awareness of territory extremely important from the outset. In primary schools, the infant school, all female teachers, and mixed, of course. then the primary school for the Christian Brothers, which was boys only. The territory, such as it was, that was mapped for us was Thomingate. That's to say, the Treaty Stone to Thomond Park, then out to the foot of Hartigan's Hill, the distillery, and the spur up to Farnshawn up from Lanny's before it gave way to the Ennis Road and its salubrious environs. Social boundaries were marked territorially, though not absolutely. There was a sense that the north side of the city was different. St. John's, if you looked at the schools, St. John's, St. Patrick's, Leamy's, John the Baptist, 2nd Street, the Model, they were all very, very different places. They were over there. And indeed, it was the case also for convents. They had their own social geography, the convents and the social geography of girls for primary schools in particular. The Christian Brothers, in our case, for example, had a house of their own on the North Circular Road, St. Teresa's. So that it was the only way. All of the other brothers lived in Sexton Street, from St. John's and the other schools. The north side, St. Munchin's, had their own house over in St. Teresa's in the North Circular Road. It was a kind of separate kingdom, and rivalries were mostly in sport. Otherwise, there was relatively little contact at primary school level. Social class mattered, especially where corporation housing schemes had heavy populations of children. But the zonal dimension was not an absolute. It was not an absolute in school. There were other ways in which one would look out for it, as I remember. For example, the awareness of those who took school meals, the bun and milk as it was called, very common to make that distinction. Who took it? Who needed it? What did that mean? The idea, however, that impoverishment was general is one that needs to be qualified. Yes, there was a great sense of the dampness of rooms, the dampness of clothing, the smell of damp from clothes hanging up on those racks and so on. But there was no, and the other thing was prevalence of hair lice, extremely common and extremely frowned upon. But nonetheless, there was nobody went to school barefoot. That was gone. And indeed, if you look at the other aspects of the schools, what is striking about them is the sense of ambition that was being instilled in what was supposed to be, as it were, a working class, or indeed a fairly tough, as it were, school down the crossroad. School concerts, ambitious and widely supported. For example, when we went to the Christian Brothers in the primary school, the Christmas concert for a full week sold out. The brothers going up with a horse and car up to the railway station to collect 5 and 6 huge baskets, hampers of clothing hired from Gings or from Burke's in Dublin. The concerts themselves, full of plays, full of choirs, full of all sorts of things, and every talent, as it were, encouraged. Not only that, but makeup artists brought in and special costumes for all of the things. And we were precocious. There was more cross-dressing in Thomingate in the 1950s than there was in Midtown Manhattan at the same time. But having said that, the fact is that this was, by any standards, an ambitious school from the point of view of the talents of children. Yes, teams in hurling and football, the Spillane, the Olo, the O'Mara Cups, as it were. And there were the signs of some notions creeping in. In our 5th year, the brothers decided in Thomingate that we needed blazers. And the blazers were brought in, which was the dark blue with the edgings in yellow cord, as it were. And that was a sign of ambition, and some felt some notions there, getting to know themselves a bit. But it was a sign of changing times. Was school life itself as grim as conventional wisdom in the 50s holds? Well, corporal punishment certainly was a feature, but it was a feature in all schools. There were certain refinements in schools. The corporal punishment in one of the classes that we were in, I see Penny Meehan up there, corporal punishment in one of the classes that we were in was at least accompanied by some literary reference, because the teacher called it Excalibur, as it came down whacking us on the palms of the hand. But nonetheless, that was physical punishment was fairly common at the time. The attention of the school attendance officers, mitching was a habit, or mooching as it was often called as well. The attendance officers had difficulty in combating it, but yet there were sanctions that were feared. it was not uncommon to threaten Glynn or Dangan or Letterfrack, and to do it very explicitly and very darkly in a way that made it clear that this might happen. We went on visits. Once a year, I think, I'm open to correction here, Paddy, we went to Glynn once a year. I think Tony Dillon here, my schoolmates are here from Dublin. We went out to Glynn. There were two views to it. One was to give us an idea of what would happen. It was kind of to let you dare but for the grace of God. But the other was to make sure we mixed with the boys who had been unlucky enough to end up in Glynn. And there'd be sports and a big, huge refectory table with buns and sandwiches. What do I call to mind of that, apart from the fact that it happened and that I do register it? Small things. For example, the sandwiches are distinct from the buns. A boy sitting alongside us who was in Glynn, and the plate of buns were offered, and he said, no, I prefer the bread with the maize in it, which was the sandwich. Those kind of things that registered easily as to what exactly was the life experience. We were aware of it at the time, as well as having a different perspective in retrospect, once you look and see the Ireland that was gone. There are other things that have called to mind. For example, the difficulty that was encountered by some of the brothers in keeping even very bright lads staying on to the end of the primary. If there was a job going as a messenger boy for Lipton's, or if there was a job going where a few bob could be made. And there were some very bright exited early, it was difficult to make them stay to the end of primary school because the temptations of employment on messenger bikes in particular, not telegrams now, they came later, but the messenger bikes from most of the retail outlets. Now, secondary school, very quickly, not all of the primary children, of course, went on any further with education or training for secondary school. Social class, family expectations, these were significant factors in the encouragement that was given by teachers. So far as secondary schools were concerned, there was a very clear understanding of the different configurations of the secondary schools. The Jesuits at the Crescent had a particular clientele. This was stereotype. There unquestionably were all different types of boys in the Crescent, but the dominant image was that most of the boys, or a large portion of them, were destined to have their names on plates in Mallow Street or in Glentworth Street at a very early date, either in the medical or the legal profession, or those that might go somewhere else. St. Munchauns College, the boarders were the important ones there because they were going on to Maynooth. But there were others also who may not make Maynooth and who may have to settle for creamery manager in Cantor, who effectively had rural connections that were essentially part of the strong farmer class that essentially was going to be the backbone of the rural society. St. Clement's and Sexton Street, of course. Sexton Street was the great hold-all and the meritocracy. It was the Darwinian world where you had to work hard to get on. Scholarships, clerkships, white collars. It was a question of you were going to make it by sheer pressure, as it were, for exams. Girls' schools also had their own configuration, of course. Laurel Hill, St. Mary's, Mount Carmel, the Mount Salesians, the Presentation. I should say that for those of us, and certainly for me, we knew there was such a place as Villiers, but it was terra incognita complete. It was Protestant Limerick of which we had no knowledge whatsoever. Very little structured contact between the secondary schools. Not much interaction, formal or sanctioned. The small number of big occasions in which the schools would assemble could be counted in one hand. The Pioneer Rally in the Savoy was one of them. And one could see the social regimentation of the different schools being given their assigned spots in the Savoy. So Laurel Hill sat alongside Crescent, and so on and so forth. Territory had changed for the boys and girls, of course, on the north side. We were going across the town now. Technical education. The two major locations, so O'Connell Avenue, the Red Tech, of course, and St. Anne's. Extremely important in terms of what the economy needed and so on and so forth. Didn't register hugely with those who were going to secondary schools. Now, all of this is pre-UL Limerick. All of this is pre-Plassey. All of this is the world in which, in effect, careers and so on that were in prospect in secondary schools were fairly straightforwardly predictable. I can recall at the end of, coming up to our leaving certificate, probably the end of 5th year rather than the start of 6th year, a teacher asking in class, just people to give an indication of what they had in mind, as it were. And this now were those who had survived the leaving certificate class. And one thing that struck, I remember saying it at the time, and we often say it afterwards, since myself and Davy Hanley, whenever we get together and have a chat, that the question was, how many boys, or are there any boys here going to university? 1961. 2 out of 67 that were in that room between the A and the B class, 2 put up their hands and were brave enough to put up their hand. There were probably a small cohort who had hopes but dared to put up their hand because it depended on scholarships. Only 2 were able confidently to state that they were going to the university, but that wasn't the interesting thing. As Davy Handley always reminds me, they weren't the 2 brightest in the class. But they had they knew that that was in store, that they were effectively on track for that. What else was there? The call to training, the Junior X and Customs and Excise, the ESB, Board Namona, the local government panel, whether it was for the local government service director or for the library service, a panel which stayed in operation for a year, so that it was noted, you're number 85, they're down to number 67. You're number 60, whatever it is, there's only 4 more left, and will we get it before the end of the year, and will there be a call? And then other white-collar clerkships, and then beyond that again, those who were able to go into the retail sector because their fathers had been there already. Those who were effectively going to go into, let us say, men's tailoring establishment, with clean white shirts and so on and so forth, starting at the bottom. Starting at the bottom meaning that the best you could hope for initially would be, with the small pay and keeping yourself clean and making sure that your breath was clear, get down the Hortex tie and the stockings out of a box and make sure that they fitted well. Then after a time, getting confident enough to give advice. And then finally, after 20 years, 25 years, measuring the inside leg for the clothes. You can run through this wonderful odyssey, and you can see how long it took, and you can also see the kind of deference and the kind of hierarchy that operated. And these were those who were lucky that they were going into employment, as it were. I'll have a word about what disrupted that in a moment. 1 or 2 other points, very briefly. The debates and drama in secondary school did develop skills. There wasn't formally career guidance as such, apart from an intensive exam orientation for those of us who were in the Brothers, certainly, for gaining access to much prized white-collar employment. Mostly occasional pep talks from successful past pupils who would be brought in, as it were, to encourage. There were teachers who did encourage boys to set their standards high, and it happened fairly early. Some teachers were better than others, and there were different methods of doing it. Anne Malone is up there, and her father, Lord have mercy on him, Midge Malone, as we know him. Midge had a great trick of putting a target out in front. He would take out a copybook that he had from a previous genius, and he would put it around the class. Tony Finan or Michael Wallace, who was in UL for many years, and he would say, "Boys, that's what you need to aim for if you want to end up doing the business," as it were. So motivation was handing out exemplary pieces of work from the successful people, and effectively that was as near as you got, as it were, to career guidance. The extended territory of the school at secondary level did expand, principally through sporting things. We became familiar with the Hill in Buttevant, with Mallow, with other provincial towns where the Harty Cup matches or the football matches would be played. Exceptionally a trip to Killarney, but that was quite exceptional. Buttevant was the great Mecca. If you went to Buttevant, you'd see Christian brothers from all over the countryside and the odd priest from Flannan's, and they were bound to win. But that was neither here nor there. What you had was a wider circle. I should say that beyond the school, and you'll be pleased to know that I am going beyond the school, socialising beyond the school, they were related to a number of things in Limerick, as I recall it in the 50s. Sport, leisure and entertainment, shopping, and religion. So far as sport was concerned, I won't spend long on it. Limerick had then, and has now, a reputation as being a sports-mad city. Certainly the sheer variety of sports and enthusiasms of followers was striking. Loyalties were intense and exclusive, in all codes. In rugby, Shannon, All Crescent, Bowes, Young Munster, Gearoid, and of course the junior clubs, Thomond, Richmond, St Mary's and so on. Huge rivalries, bitter rivalries, the Bateman Cup and so on. Social class was crucial. Social class was absolutely crucial in membership. And this is not a matter of retrospect only. For example, people coming to the town, to the city of Limerick, who were coming to the bank very often, no matter what it was, provincial, Munster and Leinster or Bank of Ireland. Clerks coming from elsewhere were taken in by the manager and were advised to the clubs, the sporting clubs, that they should, and in some instances that they ought to join. There was a great story told of a man who got one cap for Ireland, actually played often for Munster, second lock forward, called Tom Nesdale. He lodged up in Farnshone. Tom Nesdale came to Limerick from a private school in Cork, fee-paying school as we would now call them. And the story is told that he went into his bank manager, and when he was asked what rugby club he wished to join, he was a fine rugby player, he said, Young Munster. And there was a look of total horror and incomprehension on the bank manager's face. But he gently prodded him and said, Tom, do you mind my asking, why is that? And Nesdale gave a famous answer. He said, well, I want to play rugby in Limerick, and I have two choices. I either play for Young Munster or I play against Young Munster. The choice was an easy one for him. In fact, he played his career in Limerick with Gearoid, as those of you here know. But rugby clubs, the notation of the rugby clubs on both sides of the river, indeed, and the different one, and the same was true, certainly, of the rowing clubs. Membership of the rowing clubs and the different loyalties, every bit as closely guarded, every bit as deeply loyal, and with strong salience of social class. Not exclusive, but very pointedly so, when one up from St Michael's. For example, St Michael's, when they began to, as it were, become competitive, were able to recruit from Garda Síochána. So the Henry Street Gardaí went down to St Michael's, rather than to any of the two on the bridge, and certainly not over to Atlunkard. But these were things that sometimes didn't even have to be spoken about. It was what was expected and what was done. There were other things. I could spend a long time on this. The pubs, for example, through which the different territories were noted. Albie Carroll's up in the Yellow Road, Lanny Fraser's, indeed the whole traffic down from Hassett's Cross down to the Treaty Stone was marked entirely by the pubs on either side. Whether you started off at Hassett's Cross, Patrick Quilty's, Lanny Fraser's, Josephine Hogan's, down to Menahan's and the North Star, then on down to Toomey's opposite the Treaty Stone itself. And different clientele going to different ones. And in two or three of them, the female snug with the smoked glass, where the little glass of Guinness and the schooner of port was there in order to enjoy the singing after the matches. Great theatre, as it were, of singing. Hurling and Gaelic football had loyalties no less intense, some of them bearing Civil War echoes. St Patrick's and Claghon, for example, Treaty Sarsfields on the other side of the river, Young Ireland's, and indeed those on the edge of the city, but were not then on the edge of the city, were outside the city altogether. Ahan, Mungret, Cracora, South Liberties, and so on. The Gaelic grounds itself, midweek tournaments on Wednesday nights. People talk about the club championships. Club championships which were for charitable causes, always enveloped in loyalty to the church and to the religious orders. There were a Treat House tournament in which Dennis Moran put up the money, for example, and what was the story? The clubs, from the leading clubs from Galway, Castlegar, Thurlough Ahan, Thurles, Sarsfields, Sarsfields in Glenrowers from Cork, and so on, Mount Sion from Waterford. Midweek. Prizes, a suit length. You got a suit length, and that was the prize for it. Watches came later, but the suit lengths were the thing that's the most prized winner's trophy. Fierce, intense loyalties. I lived for 25 years in Castlegar after we were married, first of all. And my first memories of Castlegar was when they were getting a bit heavy, as it were. But what would happen would be, if the going was tough and if there was anybody particularly skillful that was running rings around somebody, you'd hear the shout coming from the sideline, "Give him timber, which was essentially a matter of cutting them down immediately so that there would be no more embarrassment. Now, these kind of loyalties were intense, as I say, and they remain in the memory. And all of the other things of the sporting life of the city went all over the place. Oddly enough, I'm sure many of you know it here, there were very fine snooker and billiard players, but snooker and billiards were frowned upon. And it was an odd thing. They were frowned upon, the sign of the misspent youth. Yeah. But oddly enough, and this is one of the ironies and contradictions, the snooker and billiards were essentially in temperance halls. They were in temperance halls, which essentially ought to have been safe environments, certainly free of drink and rowdiness. But somehow they were frowned upon. The darkness and so on, the umbral world of snooker and billiards was seen as something that was slightly off. On the other hand, the hierarchy of the city was clearly noted altogether in something like the Limerick Show. The Limerick Show, for those of us who were not well off, was a matter of trying to find some time in the evening in Green Park we could sneak in under something. Sneak in under tarpaulin, sneak in under the edge, or get somebody to get you in for the last 20 minutes of the show jumping. But otherwise, it was entirely another world. And I just checked to see the Limerick Horse Show Committee, 1958. County Limerick, the county set, plus the wealthiest elsewhere of the city. And just names to jog the memory of some of you here: Mr. G. O'Brien, Mr. J. A. Walsh, Harry Russell, P.F. Quinlivan, Major Hastings, Commander Fitzgerald, Colonel O'Grady, Commander Monsell, any of you here? Dr. Mary Roach Kelly, Mr. J. N. Canty, Roycroft, Frost, Dwyer, Lord Inchiquin. A fine committee. Or as they would say, a fine committee. But nonetheless, you knew exactly who were the county show, and you knew exactly why it was that you had to sneak in under the tarpaulin or try and get somebody to bring you in over the stile. This was a different world entirely. A different world entirely. One other thing I should mention perhaps is, the swimming, of course, the baths at Corby and in the island as well, the public baths. My memory is of crowds, the bustle of crowds, and of course the dearth of facilities, the number of times you saw teams togging out the side of the road or trying to find the protection of a sciach for some kind of protection. Nevertheless, I was checking out the numbers. This is one way where memory needs to be jogged. And the actual attendances reported were much lower than my memory of the crowded places would indicate. And much lower indeed than the photographs suggest. Photographers were in the habit of photographing the crowd just immediately in front of, and therefore there was a sense that it was crowded, whether it was the Markets Field for dogs or whether it was whatever it was. Whereas you look at the attendance reported afterwards in the papers, and it's quite low, or it seems modest certainly. And oddly enough, the 1955 Munster final between Limerick and Clare, played in a heat wave outside in the Innis Road grounds, the Gaelic grounds, where Limerick won famously after all the years, was the lowest Munster final attendance in decades. And I don't remember it like that. All I remember is crowds and crowds and crowds. But you need to have, this is where, as White tells us, the historical record does in fact correct the memory and subverts it by leaving the evidence. Women, certainly hockey, tennis and camogie. Camogie, very much a minority addendum to the GAA calendar of events. Soccer, overwhelmingly working class. Overwhelmingly working class, and more particularly overwhelmingly orientated also towards English soccer heroes. The cigarette cartons that came out with the photographs of Tom Finney and Stanley Matthews and so on and so forth. And for what it's worth in terms of culture wars, 1950s style. When Limerick eventually did high enough in the soccer in order to be able to attract the young boys of Bern to Limerick, the first continental European team to play, there was great excitement about it. But those in the GA who felt that this was a terrible intrusion and that the walls of the city were about to fall had to find something to put on that night. It was midweek, it was Wednesday. Very hard to fill a calendar. The only thing they could get that would be organised on the night in question was a camogie match. There was a camogie match advertised to be exactly the same time as the Burren Young Boys were playing the Limerick soccer side. It delved out of the heavens, it were. But I always thought there was a wonderful, wonderful appropriateness of it. Getting a place for it, there was no point in having it outside in the Gaelic grounds. It would have looked deserted and it would have been shabby and it would have been up to me. So the camogie match that was to rival the Burren Young Boys was played in the grounds of the mental hospital by the town of Mulgresley, and I always thought it made its own statement about what exactly was going on. There you are. That was the mid-1950s and the culture wars. Now, all of this, as we know, was at a time when there was no television, where you either watched a game, you participated in a game, or you listened, if it was big enough, to the game on the radio. The voices of radio: Liam Brown and Austin Darragh and Bill Toomey for the rugby, Philip Green and of course Tony Sheehan with these famous reports, "My game today was at Tolka Park," where the same phrases and cliches came out week after week of the team. So-and-so rattled the woodwork. There was one of them as well for hitting the crossbar. There were the same phrases. And of course, Micheál O'Hare, the young one with her thick, and the 10 o'clock Sunday night Sean Ogle Calachoin, the Manidee of Accordi Vale, where we came in contact for the first time without benefit of a geography book, with such exotic places as Longford Slashers and Cooley Kickens and all sorts of people that sounded as if they had walked straight out of Genghis Khan. Nevertheless, this was a great world of contest. We knew that there were great contests going on in these far-flung places. No local radio, of course, one station anywhere. The other leisure activities: dancing, ballroom dancing. Rock and roll arrived in the 50s. Dances in the city, huge. The Stella, Todsey O'Brien's inside in St. Mary's. Some that were not noted at the time. For example, I looked at the official Limerick handbook for 1953, which was published by the precursor of Borfalte, where they listed entertainments in Limerick. They did not list fogs, Fog of Ballach. They didn't list the fogs at all. But they did list Cruises Hotel and the Stella as the two main places. The bands, Mick Delahunty. An interesting thing about music, the bands that were common: Tommy Cleary and his orchestra, Peter Dempsey and his, John McMahon and Charlie Sasha, those who were regulars in the city. Many of them were scaled down versions of what the big band sound of the Americans, where there were trumpets and there was brass. But Clancy played in a number of them. But a number of them also had the Palm Grove Orchestra, the large piano accordions, which Peter Dempsey had and which Tommy Cleary had, where they played for a particular style of dancing, the salsas and the foxtrots and the tangos and so on, a la Parisienne rather than the American style. But they had huge audiences, all of them. Music in the theatre, music certainly, bands from school, both organ bands and accordion bands. The major marching bands and the major bands for playing formally, of course, were the brass and reed and the fife and drums. The Boher Boy, the St. Mary's, the brass and reed, St. John's, the Limerick Pipe Band, and of course, I was able to see in its heyday, not perhaps its heyday, but in its decline, but still it was there, Mikey Rowley's band. Mikey Rowley's band was also always included in the parades. Recitals, bandstands in the People's Park, and occasionally on day journeys, Sunday journeys down to Kilkee in the bandstand in Kilkee. Musical societies, the Sicilians, but also, and I think it is important to remember this, at a time when, people didn't travel that much, there was Grand Opera in Limerick, and there was Grand Opera in Kilrush, and people were brought from the Welsh Opera, William Dickey, Roland. They were brought and they sang with the cream of Limerick talent. Huge voices from all of the city choirs. The Brins, the McCanns, Tom Henn, Yelverton, Joan Eland, Mary MacDonough. Full casts and chorus that were singing two of the operas, and not light musicals. The Sicilians had their own programme, but Grand Opera played in Limerick, and as I said, Grand Opera played in Kilrush. We tend to see the 1950s as, before the great expansion of entertainment and so on and so forth. Where's Grand Opera in Kilrush today? Where's Grand Opera in Limerick today? You need to see things in perspective, as I say. Féile Limni, a big festival across all the disciplines. The ambience, social again, very important. Social class and the right setting for things was everywhere. For example, the famous Cup for Moore's Melodies, which was one of the most coveted of the Féile Limni trophies, was held exclusively in the lounge at Cruises Hotel, where the adjudicators were set out with a chaise longue, listening to, Silent Home Oil. There was a proper decorum about even the competitive singing at the time. Theatre, the college players, and a renaissance of other groups, amateur groups indeed. We tend to think of this all beginning the amateur thing in the 1950s as it did, and in the case of Limerick, of course, it was one of the earliest places where Sive and the John D. Keane, as it were, industry took off. But I think it's important to remember how lively the theatre scene in Limerick was itself, from the late 40s through and right through the 50s. And names that are forgotten: Kitty Breeden, Bab Shanahan, Michael Donovan Schofield, Jimmy Quealy, Tony Lynch. Names that were played across the whole spectrum of stuff. I saw Strindberg in Limerick as a boy, as a secondary school student, and thought nothing of it, that it was good drama on stage. So that the notion of isolationism and so on and so forth, or introverted, doesn't stand up to the scrutiny of what actually went on. The central institution of entertainment across all classes, and the one that was the great leveller, even more so than dancing, was cinema. Cinema and the pictures were at the absolute height in Limerick in the 1950s. Queues, trailers, days, and all manner across the way here. The Savoy, the Carlton, the Lyric, the Royal, the Grand Central, the City Theatre. Tivoli struggled on until 1959. Inside the English town, the Thomond, see Tony Dillon here, whose late father was the patron of it. And indeed in the late 1950s, for a short period, for about a decade, Robbie Donoghue, Robbie Wexford, up at the top of the high road, had the Astor. And tariffs that people could afford, sometimes comforts that were pretty rough and ready, and a tariff that even didn't require money, jam jars to get in for certain matinees, because they were tradable currencies that were for recycling. Going to the pictures, as I said, nobody went to the movies, the pictures. And that lovely book that Joe Coleman published some years back, House Full, captures that world excellently, with some lovely photographs as well. The long queues. And of course the really serious disruption of all of this entertainment only came with Lent, with all of the popular amusements, as it were, shut down for Lent, particularly in the 1950s. Which brings me to what I'm coming to the concluding part. I hope I'm not going on too long, Tony. To perhaps the central aspect of associational culture in 1950s Limerick, and that was religion. A decade, even more than a decade before, Sean O'Fueline, in a book that he put together in a hurry, a travel book around Ireland, had done a lot of calling into different places, and he immediately characterised Limerick as being mad on religion, and formal religion particularly. Religious practices were all pervasive in the associational culture of the majority of the population of Limerick City. Now, time doesn't allow me a comprehensive survey of the culture, and anyway, it's not necessary. There's a fine book published on it in the end of 2017 by Sheila DeClaire, out in UL, Popular Culture and Religion. But the things that strike me in retrospect: numbers, the sheer numbers. Sheer numbers, crowds at Mass, crowds at the novenas, crowds at solidarities. The different churches, which had different brands, as it were. What I suppose the later marketeering people would call product differentiation between Our Lady of Good Counsel for the Obbies, Our Lady Perpetual Succor, and the Redemptorists, St. Anthony for things that were lost, St. Jude, hopeless causes. I was a great follower of St. Jude. But what you had was a huge variety of devotion, a matrix, or a mosaic would be a better word for it, of devotional culture based upon saints and devotions and a whole range of religious practice. It was competitive. The confraternity, the arch confraternity, for example. Regularly, the exhortation was, What was the attendance in Belfast the week before? Are we the largest confraternity in the world, or has Belfast edged ahead? In that case, the question to the class was, which boys here of the St. John Bosco's section were not at the confraternity last week? Hand might go up and say, I couldn't do this, that, or. And then any other boys in that section, you make sure that he's up next week. So it was kind of the moral suasion of a kind. But nonetheless, it was competitive, and it worked. The intensity of devotion also. Throngs at Holy Thursday, special societies, the Legion of Mary, and so on. The huge excursions to Knock, and the way in which the excursions to Knock would be organised. Again, little memories, shards of memory, are what encapsulate the way in which a young boy registered these things. I recall being outside the Connolly Hall as the buses were leaving for the Franciscan pilgrimage to Knock. And the Third Order of St. Francis were laymen, but they were entitled to dress in the rough cloth, as it were, of the order. I'm sure many of you here will remember this. But I remember my eyes opening out wide when I saw one of them pulling up putting his hand into his pocket and taking out a baby power. I mean, the notion that before we hit the road for Knock, a baby power was necessary, with all the power that was waiting for us at the other end of the journey, was a complete scandal. It took me a long time to recover from that culture shock. But these are the things that lodge in the memory once the historical record, as it were, has been examined. You still cannot expunge, as it were. The other thing I'd like to mention, I suppose, and it is important, is the beauty of that world from an aesthetic point of view. And it's a point that John McGahern makes in many of his writings. The actual sense of the smells of the incense, the altars, the decorations, the vestments, the lighting, whether it was the May altar in schools or in shrines, or the very large ones, and as the candles were doused with these candle things, watching the guy to see what he'd be able to do it cleanly without knocking down anything. But what was important was this: there was a wonderful sense of spectacle, of elevated spectacle about it, in lives which didn't have much elevated spectacle in the ordinary way, in work or elsewhere. The aesthetics of devotion, in other words, they did strike one. Shrines, as I said. Latin, of course, was the language of the liturgy, all pre-Vatican II. And the other thing one remembers is the sheer visibility of the huge throngs of religious personnel everywhere. The number of different habits of the different nuns, the Salesians, getting to know the different ones, the numbers of clerical garb that one would see all the time. There was a photograph in that collection that was published of the photographs of the Limerick leaders, Limerick through the lens, of outside the door of this very building, the main building of Mary I, 1959 I think it is. And you see the serried ranks of nuns, rows and rows and rows, that were available for teaching and for devotional purposes. The churches themselves, again, as with Villiers I should say, the word ecumenism was not in the vocabulary. Interfaith activity or events in the civic sphere that I recall were not evident. At a more personal level, yes, we knew Protestants, and we knew ordinary Protestants, as it were. But nobody that I knew had ever been inside the wall of St. Mary's Cathedral, not to mind inside the church itself. Not only that, but the notion that the separate culture of leisure, for example, the LPYMA out in the Ennis Road, the businesses in the city which were reputedly very strong in terms of their recruitment policy, and these would have gone from, for example, Limerick Steamship Company, some of the office jobs, and so on. There was a notation. Was it resented? No, it was just one of those things. You took it, but you also took it that there were ordinary Protestants around who effectively who weren't seen as part of that institutional culture. When I was growing up, for example, if you were stuck for a pack of cards, you go down to Coney Ross, just at the back of the Temperance Hall in Homingate. Or else, alternatively, you'd all passing up the door, Eiley Black, for example, these were devotional Protestants who were neighbours, and that's taken for granted. But the formal culture, either of devotion or of leisure, was very clearly demarcated. And certainly we were not aware of of any sense of access to that culture at the time. Now finally, and it is finally this time, Tony, definitely, a few words on commerce and business. I've spoken on this before, trade in shops and so on. Local shops were the key, and there was again a widening this sense of territory. It's a sense of widening circles. People shopped at local shops if they could. Many people had books on tick, as it were, in the local shops. The ration books lasted up to the early 50s, but I'm not speaking of the ration books. I'm talking about books on tick, as it were. It expanded from the immediate neighbourhood of shops for groceries and for ordinary food, and then uptown for a wider choice, as it were. Uptown for a wider choice, even in the retail areas, to Lipton's, to Nelson's, E.G. Fitz, the Home and Colonial. Or up the English town for specific shops, Georgie Sullivan's, for example, for toys. Or the butchers, the huge variety of butchers, Petty Halls. And all, again, the little songs that were jingles of the 1950s. Again, Petty Hall had a reputation of being a strong Catholic. And one of the jingles was, God bless you all, says Paddy Hall, I'll sell no meat on Fridays. Because Friday was the fish day. And there were little things that stuck in the mind, but they indicated how the notation, as it were, was done as to what different premises were. Shops that had seasonal stuff. The autumn shops, for example, which would stock the window with nuts and with apples right up to the top of the window. Or the shops that we knew around the town who during the summer months would stock Dilliskin periwinkles brought up in the bus from Kilkee or brought up by somebody so that they'd be fresh in these big buckets and they would know which ones to get on a Saturday night. The centre for drapery, clothes and hardware. The larger stores, Todd's, Cannock's, before its destruction for the terrible change from the wonderful at the late 50s and early 60s again, when the clock and all the rest of it went. Rocha stores, Todd's window at Christmas. A memory I have is the amount of interior wood and timber. The interior of Todd's, for example, the different alcoves, the millinery alcove with a big roaring fire. At Christmas, Johnny McMahon in full tails and Charlie Sasha playing on the platform with a large piano. The hardware, Spates, Boyd's, Newsom's, but there were many niche stores as well. For what we suppose we would now call home decorations. Daly's for wallpaper. Hassett's, one of the places that I do recall, I mentioned this to Tom Donovan, where people went for yellow ochre. Does anyone remember yellow ochre for doing the walls, the whitewashing of the walls and doing the gable ends? Hassett's was the place. And all of these were done from large bags, measured out. And even the retail shops for tea, or more particularly for ice cream, the ice cream slicer, and seeing would you get an advantage if it came down too heavy for 2pence or whatever the case may be. So the way in which all of this was intimate face to face, and that was the way it was. The menswear stores and women's fashions also, bulk buying a novelty. The ones that bought bulk and that used to stock up the windows, as I recall, came in the late 1950s. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think it started with Duggan's, then Dennis Morden's for blankets and for, stuff, and then on to Finness's. The business stocking up the whole window from top to bottom, whether it was with blankets or nylon stockings, and putting the price in front of them. Windows piled with blankets, small furnishing stores, and more particularly the 1950s when we run from Cavendish's onwards. Small furnishing stores which were beginning to stock what would be cheap furniture, Formica top stuff for kitchens and so on, and above all else, selling on the hire purchase. Where the Cavendish's were the start on that hire purchase, where you effectively paid over a long period of time, often called the Never Never. The one I preferred was the one that just, again, the little re-reference the song, that people were buying things on the Kathleen Mavourneen, which was the way from the John McCormick song. It may be for years, it may be forever. And essentially, by the time that they paid for it. But buying on the Kathleen Mavourneen was certainly, Cavendish's was the start of that. And as I said, the butcher stores. I don't have time to go through this, but I think many of you here will certainly know that the vendors in terms of butcher stores at the time, apart from the fact that they were full and they were large staff of men behind the counter with aprons effectively chasing up and down behind long counters. But the cuts of meat, and generally speaking, above all else, the stuff that has now virtually vanished from the point of view of, some has, some hasn't. I'm thinking of the obvious ones, Packet and Tripe inside in Tracy's and Atlantford Street, in the small little house with the big statue of the Blessed Virgin in the window, as you went in to get Packet and Tripe. Or heading up to the cheaper meat, for example, for stews, up to Ray's, which was in the lee of O'Mara's, for the different ones, skirts and kidneys, eye bones, free bones, and breast bones, and the whole lot for boiling. The other ones, the treats which one went for example, the two ones that again vanished, and they're in all the backs of all of the old football and hurling programmes for people coming to Limerick, the special things. Meat tea was one of them, a meat tea, and the other one was the mixed grill. And the mixed grills varied, but the real delicacy of the mixed grill was a bit of lamb's liver battered in flour. And effectively, that put it up an extra sixpence on the full range of pork products that you'd expect in Limerick, including, of course, many pork butchers. They had an organisation of their own. Bakeries and confectioners, a huge list of them. Frank Prendergast, Lord have mercy, looked at a lot of the bakeries in his own writings, but the kind of bread itself, again, gone out of thing. It was not just ordinary sliced bread. There were cottages, there were griddle cakes, and in the confectionery, for what was left over inside in the Abbey Court with the Feeneys or down in the Imperial Bakery, there was the pieces put together as Russian slices, which again were a delicacy of mixed stuff of all sorts that was left over after all the confectionery. Medicines, and very quickly, chemists had different reputations, and more particularly there were very few of the chemists didn't have their own cough bottles and their own mixtures, which people would swear by. You'd be sent across the town to go into Broderick's because he had the best cough bottle, no matter how many chemists you had to pass on the way. They were selling it off the shelf. Housing in Limerick, the corporation didn't have a bad reputation at the time because the housing stock, as I said, was being replenished. What did have a bad reputation locally was the local health service. The dispensary was feared. The dispensary would take you short, and pulling across curtains and handing in prescriptions being made to wait. The dispensary was seen as a place of humiliation in a way that the town hall was not, if you had to go looking for anything relating to housing. These are legends. This is essentially the memory bank on which I'm calling from the evidence that I have. Now, as I said, I don't want to protract this any longer. Add to this a miscellany of sounds, sights, and smells, as it were, and they stay with me, and they prompt historical questions, and they prompt arrangements. The sounds of bicycles early morning, and bicycles at lunchtime, or coming home for your dinner in the middle of the day. Bicycles, the whirring sound of bicycles is a sound that echoes in my ear from my youth. Singing coming from pubs. Lusty singing, plenty of choral singing and so on, literally at the drop of a hat. Delivery vans, particularly the silent bread vans. Milk vans with rattling bottles, and all of the messenger bikes. The sound of women's shoes, and particularly what were known at the time as Cuban heels. They weren't the high heels and they weren't flat shoes, but they were solid blocks. And the sound of women's shoes on Sundays passing our gate as I looked over it on their way up to visit somebody in the sanatorium. It was a constant procession. They were always women, and they were always in twos, as I recall it. Two women, whether they be neighbours or sisters or a mother and daughter, but going up to the sanatorium on a Sunday at 1:30, 1:45, and the sound of these Cuban heel shoes, good solid shoes for a walk, whatever part of the city they came from. The smell of coal smoke on winter evenings, the smell of cigarettes everywhere, and the sounds of other more joyous sounds as well. The sounds of the nuns, the three blind mice outside Woolworths or outside the Gaelic grounds. The sound of horses' hooves on the road delivering coal, moving furniture. The sound of hearses making their way up Sarsfield Street, across the Saxon corner, up William Street. And occasionally, as we passed, and I had a few funerals in the 50s, both my parents died, I do recall looking and seeing members of An Garda Síochána at the William Street entrance, that arch there. The first Dunn stores, small, opened in O'Connell Street in 1960. Milk deliveries went motorised from horse-drawn in 1962, the year I left Limerick. More crucially, reflecting the new strategy and the change in the economy which would take place over the next 2 decades, really. In 1962, Krupp's opened on the outskirts of the city, the foreign direct investment and the new company. At Christmas 1962, the first cash and carry stores opened in Limerick with the pavilion stores, the era of the long counters and of large numbers of assistants being necessary to get you stuff, come out and open the biscuit tins and to fill your thing. That was destined to pass. And of course, the Shannon Duty Free and the Shannon Industrial Estate opened. And of Shannon I'll say one thing, it'll be matter for another evening, but I think the impact of Shannon and the new factories, SPS, Ripon, Lananit and so on, and the way in which the work culture changed with the buses going out from Shannon early in the morning, the recruitment of youngsters, and the way in which these youngsters were trained, sometimes sent off to Sweden for 6 weeks and so on. To rehearse what I've already said to you, think of the implications of that in terms of attitudes. Long before free secondary education and the Dun O'Malley thing came in, think of a household in which two youngsters had the prospect of either hoping they'd get in as a draper's assistant at relatively low cost and spent the 25 years being clean and tidy and went up and having a white shirt and watching yourself, not drawing attention to yourself until effectively you graduated up to being, as I said, a charge hand or measuring or whatever the case may be. And think of what happened when a 17 or an 18-year-old in Lananit or in Shannon Airport headed off in the morning at 7 a.m. and within 2 to 3 months, if they were smart and if they were supervising required or so on it may be, would be earning more than their father, who was 33 years in a drapery store. Talk about deference, talk about family order, talk about patience, talk about ambition. The way in which that impacted upon the cultural life and expectations, the horizons of ambition of the city, remains to be, if you like, investigated in full, but it was massive. So, folks, I've kept you more than long enough. In revisiting 1950s Limerick, the historian in me, of course, turns to the evidence of change, the quantifiable and concrete evidence on which to make general comments, however qualified. But my mind's eye vivifies the city as I knew it, its canvas of life and its soundtrack, and memory, prompted by these sights and sounds and images, for all the historian's rigour, memory whispers in my ear, this is how it felt, this is how it was. Thank you very much for listening.